Welcome to the Everyday Spirituality Podcast. I'm James Hazelwood, author, bishop, and spiritual companion, bringing you interviews and information at the intersection of a gritty Christian mysticism and depth psychology. You can find all the episode show notes, as well as my free Substack newsletter, Notebooks, at jameshazelwood.net. Now, on to the show. Hello, and welcome back to what is actually, it's episode 83 in total, but this is really episode 2 of the rebooted Everyday Spirituality podcast. Good to have you back. In news and updates, a couple things to bring to your attention. First off, those of you that are interested in the psychology of Carl Jung and the interaction with spirituality might be interested in the New York Jung on the Hudson event, which will take place July 16 to 22. You can click a link in the show notes on the podcast webpage at jameshazelwood.net/podcast. What's particularly good about this for those of us interested in the interaction of spirituality and psychology is that Lionel Corbett is going to be presenting, and he has a new book called The God Image, From Antiquity to Jung, and it is complete. And I read it over the winter and just saturated with all kinds of information about the history of the God image in mostly Western traditions, and also obviously Jungian psychology. So that's one event. The other thing is, some of you know this, but next January, my wife Lisa and I will be leading a trip to Israel-Palestine, a Holy Land trip for about 10 days, January 15 to 25. If that's something that you've never done and is of interest to you, we will not only visit the ancient stones of many of the sites of the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament, but also we will visit our partners in the Lutheran churches in the West Bank, Palestinian Christians. And so it has both a contemporary application as well as a historical event. And there's a link to the information page in the show notes. A couple of you have asked where the phrase gritty mysticism comes from. And I must confess it is not of my own origination. It comes from a book called Contemplating Christ, the Gospels and the Interior Life by Vincent Pizzuto. Vincent is an Episcopal priest, and he's also a professor at the University of San Francisco. This is a wonderful book that I found last year. It's along the lines of Richard Rohr's The Universal Christ. I think where it's different here is that Pizzuto goes into some broader Christian perspectives, including the Eastern Orthodox concept of deification, and he connects that with Contemplating Christ and the Gospels. So that's where the phrase comes from. I found it in that book, and I just loved it. Two things about the Weird Wisdom for the Second Half of Life book. First off is I've just finished a discussion guide for those of you interested in leading a small group discussion, or just want to work through it on your own. You can do that too. A link to that is in the show notes. There's no cost. You can just download that PDF. And I finished recording the audiobook version. That is now in the post-production editing and sound check phase. So we've got that shipped out. So I'll let you know when that is published. In personal news and updates, thank you for the correspondence that you've been sending, most of it in response to the Substack newsletter that I write, to a two-part section on why do bad things happen? Trying to grapple with the theological and the psychological implications of that. And so I had a couple of comments and questions that were related to that. First off, Jim from Rhode Island, no relation, wrote about my references to Rabbi Kushner. He writes, Rabbi Kushner was a personal friend of mine. We met as fellow members of the Natick, Massachusetts Rotary Club, and our friendship continued for many years. In addition to our many discussions, he had volunteered to come to our church in Rhode Island for a discussion time. Sadly, we were unable to get a good date for both of us. Your newsletter email brought back many good memories and thoughts at that time. I do believe that you would have really enjoyed a conversation or two with Rabbi Kushner. He was a very open and engaging person. I do miss him and our conversations. I think many of us would have enjoyed a conversation with Rabbi Harold Kushner. So thanks for writing about that, Jim. Carol writes to ask about the God pronouns. She writes, quote, in your recent notebooks, you refer to God as they. Is this the new jargon, trying to make others feel included? And I responded saying, I hadn't had that particular aspect in mind, but I can certainly see where that would be helpful for some people. It's my attempt to try to move away from using the pronoun he to refer to God, which implies a male God, father God, a dude in the sky, if you will. So I just play with different approaches. Sometimes I change the pronouns back and forth to he or to she, or sometimes write she/he. And this time I just thought I'd try to play with they. It does suggest plural, which makes you kind of wonder, is Hazelwood going in a polytheistic direction? That wasn't what I was intending, but maybe there are multiple expressions of God. So that was the intent behind that. And the last of the three that I had was Sue asked a question about John 14:6 and the seemingly exclusionary saying of Jesus, quote, I am the way, the life, and the truth. No one comes to the Father except through me. Rather than respond to her, I actually sent the link to a sermon that I preached on this very text at Redeemer Lutheran Church in Bangor, Maine. They recorded that as a part of their worship service. It's on their Facebook page, and if you're interested, I put a link in the show notes, and it begins at the 26-minute mark, but you can check that out there. So, always welcome to hear from you, jim@jameshazelwood.net. You can ask questions, comments, so forth and so on. A couple of things in personal news before we get to our interview. As I'm recording this in the middle of May 2023, I am in the midst of a serious battle with a groundhog, several deer, a raccoon, and a skunk who have found our vegetable garden. So the garden is delayed while I install a fence around the raised beds. And I'm telling you, that is a whole lot easier said than done. And if you've tried digging post holes in New England rocky soil, you know what I'm talking about. Most of my work days these days is preparing for our Synod Assembly, where I'm interviewing a number of people ranging from subjects of how they are serving under-resourced populations to challenges of church closings to how spirituality is impacting their work in the area of anti-racism. So some of those conversations may appear here on the podcast in the coming months. I've got some great guests lined up, including Larita Coleman Brown, who has a wonderful new book out on the 20th century mystic and civil rights leader Howard Thurman. So that'll be out soon, that conversation with her. Later this summer, I'll be talking with Dale Allison, who is a Princeton seminary professor who kind of broke ranks from his scholarly writing and has written a truly fascinating book. It's a collection of people's mystical experiences. And so I'll be talking with Dale. But today we're talking with another Dale. And so let's get to our conversation with Pastor Dale Selover. of the House Next Door ministry. So today on the Everyday Spirituality podcast, I am with Pastor Dale Selover, and she serves as the director of the House Next Door, which we're going to hear and talk about what that is. It's a ministry of Prince of Peace Lutheran Church in Princeton Junction, New Jersey, which is, yes, close to that kind of obscure university that some of you might have heard of. She does spiritual direction, retreat ministry. She did her training as a spiritual director through the Oasis Ministries, and she's also now on the teaching staff there. So I guess that must have been you were a good student.
Exactly.
She's a pastor in the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, and she served a number of congregations in New Jersey. And Dale, I am so pleased to have you with me today.
I am so honored that you invited me. Thank you so much.
Yeah, as you said, this is your first podcast. So,
Yes.
it's kind of like the first time you get out on a bike. Maybe that's not a good analogy. I don't know how.
It's going to be good because we're doing it together. So
that's right.
We're in partnership here, so I'm not worried.
Exactly. So let's just talk a little bit about you and how you got interested in spiritual direction. Then later we'll talk about the House Next Door. So spiritual direction, first of all, what is it and how did you get interested in it?
Well, I'll start with how I got interested, Jim. And that was, I can literally remember the moment. I grew up in the Lutheran Church, obviously loved the church, loved the liturgy. I was sitting in the back pew of Zion Lutheran Church, Long Valley, New Jersey, with our 1-year-old. And my husband was the preacher at the time, and he is my absolute favorite preacher. So this is not a commentary on his preaching. But I remember sitting in the midst of worship and feeling all of a sudden like this isn't enough. I started to feel this hunger in myself. And I knew right away that the hunger was a hunger to go deeper specifically with my relationship with God. And so I just started listening to that. And at the same time, coincidentally, not so much coincidence, right? I started hearing about spiritual direction, which I knew nothing about. And I got myself a spiritual director, and she led me to some classes that were all classes. In fact, the first class I took, I think, was called Deepening Christianity. And I thought, oh, deepening, that's got to be the class for me. But really, it was my own hunger that led me on this path. And so I think for me, spiritual direction is about hungry people coming together. The director of Oasis Ministries, the previous director, the founder of Oasis Ministry, talks about how spiritual direction is one beggar helping another beggar find bread. And so I think it's about sitting with folks who are hungry for that deeper relationship with God and ultimately with one another.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And is that something you're seeing more people are hungry than previous?
I think I'm seeing it in different ways. And the way I will name that is when we started the House Next Door, it was really meant to be for mission, for evangelism. The House Next Door is literally next door to Prince of Peace Lutheran Church. And our calling, we felt, was to those who were not walking through the doors of the church. We thought, okay, people aren't walking through the doors of the church into the sanctuary. We're going to have an open door of the House Next Door for people to come flocking through that door and to encounter Christ, God's Spirit in that way. And we were about 2 years in. My calendar was full with directees, with retreats. And all of a sudden, I noticed that every single person walking through the doors of the house was a church person, someone that was connected to a congregation, not necessarily ours, any congregation, in some way, shape, or form. And at first I thought, wait a minute, this isn't why we're here. We're here to do evangelism out in the community. And I really had to shift my thinking because I thought, my goodness, the calendar is full. And as I'm sitting with all these different folks and listening to them, it was like, oh my goodness, these are church people who are starving. They're people who want a deeper relationship with God.
Yeah, and so on the one hand, that could be a little bit of an indictment of the church, but we could go there, but let's not go there. Let's go in the direction rather of, so what happens in these spiritual direction sessions with people? I assume it's not therapy. What's going on? What are you doing? Or what are they doing?
Yeah, and what are we doing together, right? You know, it's interesting when people say to me, oh, so you're no longer a parish pastor. I started to say, no, I'm not. And then I corrected myself and I'm like, no, I am. This is just a bigger view of what it is to be the church, because certainly what's happening at the house is all about the business of God and Jesus and Spirit. I think we're just providing, to use the mission statement of the house next door, a safe place and a place of grace for folks to dwell in the heart of God. It's a safe space. It's a place of grace. And while I like to think, and I know as a parish pastor, I worked very hard at making sure my congregations were safe spaces and places of grace, we know that that's not everybody's experience. And so we are really, really intentional about that.
So I assume the conversations you have are around people's doubts, around people's questions, around their wonderings, and that's a big piece of it. And so when you say safe place, it's a place for people to explore their spirituality.
Absolutely. Our welcome mat in the front of the house says, come as you are. And again, while I like to think that's what every congregation does, we are so intentional about naming those things. You are welcome to show up as you are. You had asked before or said before, I'm assuming this is not counseling, and it's not counseling. The difference is in counseling, you're kind of looking right to understand who I was and how have I been formed. And often you're in the business of problem solving, right? Understanding who I am so I can figure out how do I tend to this relationship, this situation in my life. Spiritual direction is more about companioning those with whom I sit. It is my job to create a space, to hold a space where we are so intentional about saying this time is for God, right? I mean, we know we're with God always, but we're saying, oh, this hour is carved out for me and for God. And so it's really my job to be about holy listening. And it's not my job to advise, to counsel, to advise, though sometimes I do a little bit of that, but it's really my job to listen. And I think the questions of spiritual direction, or I love calling it spiritual companionship, because even though I'm the director, it's the Holy Spirit who's directing us, right? It's my job to companion. And if I were to sum up what spiritual companionship is in a question or two, it would be, you'll come to me and talk with me about whatever's on your mind, on your heart. And I'm listening for, where is God in this for you? Or what is God inviting you to? So you may come with a relationship situation, right? You're in the midst of a relationship that's broken and you're wondering what to do about that. In counseling, you're going to look at, how do I tend to this? How do I fix this? We're looking at, what's God inviting you to as you tend to this relationship? Where's the invitation for you? Where's God at work in this situation? So it's a little different way of getting into it.
Yeah, interesting. And so Oasis Ministries, it's where you did your training, and you teach there. What do you teach at Oasis Ministries?
I'm not doing it at the moment because I have so much happening at the house next door, but Oasis is a training ministry. While they do have like day retreats, morning retreats, their main mission is to provide training for spiritual directors, spiritual companions. So they have 3-year-long programs One is their, spiritual direction for spiritual guides, where you get trained to be a spiritual director. One is deepening year, which is kind of a follow-up year for spiritual directors. And then they had contemplative leadership, which was very much about, how do I bring this contemplative life, these spiritual practices, into my daily life and into leadership positions? So we've kind of taken a break from that course at the moment, but yeah, it was such a joy for me to engage in that class and help create that class and look at kind of the practicality, right? Oh, it's great if I've learned spiritual practices as a person of faith, as a child of God, but how do I take that next step and bring that back with me into my congregation, into my church council meetings, and for others, whatever their place of vocation is.
Interesting. Yeah, contemplative leadership, the two words that we don't often think of going together.
Exactly. And they're so important. Yeah. How do we bring that sense of listening to the work that we do? And I have to tell you, one of the things I love about the house next door is that this ministry totally came out of listening. My own personal listening for where was God calling me next, and then the congregation's listening to where God was calling us, listening to the community, and then listening to the needs of the people who were walking through these doors. So, I'm just convinced that all of ministry has got to be grounded in listening. And I think especially, not that it shouldn't always have been, but I think in this new day of church, right, as we're figuring out how we're called to be church in these times, we've got to be listening for the Spirit and the Spirit's invitation.
Well, and that also speaks to a deep need in certainly U.S. culture, where we just continue to hear again and again the plight of loneliness.
Yes.
And boy, when I'm with somebody who listens to me, it can be life changing.
I think there's no greater gift that we can give one another than to let the other person know, I have seen you and I have heard you. Because one of the things that occurred to me is we're living into this mission statement of a safe space and a place of grace. And I have to say that mission statement, there's always, when you create a mission statement, right, there's always supposed to be this formal process, right? The leaders get together and we name the mission statement and then we live into it. We had created a mission statement at the house next door. I can't even tell you what it was right now. It was very abstract. And this mission statement came out of people coming to the house and listening to them and going, oh, I heard myself saying, these folks are looking for a safe space. These folks are looking for a place of grace to dwell in the heart of God. So even our mission statement came out of the listening. But the other thing that occurred to me, again, as we look at our culture, I thought, oh my goodness, there don't appear to be a lot of safe spaces these days in our nation. A lot of places of grace, right? And we're even finding that with so much discord, there are times the church isn't feeling like a safe space for people. People's dining room tables are not feeling like safe spaces and places of grace, right? Because we're having these polarized conversations. And so I thought, oh my goodness, this organic, safe space, place of grace is so needed, because I don't think there's a lot of that going on right now in our country.
Now, you've mentioned, you're so right on that on so many levels. You've mentioned House Next Door. Let's get into that now. So what is it and how did it come to be?
Oh my gosh. How did it come to be? One word, God. God. God's hands are all over this. Divine intervention. My husband, Peter, was called to Prince of Peace in the traditional role of pastor 10 years ago. When we arrived here, I took some sabbatical time, been serving in congregations for almost 30 years, never had sabbatical, felt a need for some breathing room to get our children settled in this new community. But But also, I really was feeling an invitation to step away from traditional parish ministry. I'd been dabbling in spiritual direction and retreats for years. And when I first started doing it 20 some years ago, I remember saying to my husband, Peter, gosh, I wish I could be called to this work. I wish I could be called to this work. And I guess God heard that call. So we come to Prince of Peace, and I'm listening for where's God going to invite me next. In a very practical way, the church had a house that was standing empty. They had plans to raise it, to build a parking lot, and those plans were not coming to fruition, thanks be to God. And we heard a language in the congregation of spirit that we really hadn't heard in former congregations. We were like, these folks talk a little differently than our other people do. And so this wonderful invitation of a new call and me listening for something new and this house. And Peter and I stepped into the house and said, oh my gosh, there's a spirit in this place. It has got to be used for ministry. And about a year after we were here, the council said, anybody in the congregation is welcome to come and brainstorm about what we might do with the house. And so we gathered together, and mine was, one of many ideas of, well, what if we turned it into a spiritual formation center? And that was where the congregation really was feeling led. And so for the past 9 years, it has unfolded, literally starting with making this house usable because it had stood vacant for quite some time, to filling it with retreats and directees. Now we have a counseling center here, but then it's spilled over into our backyard where we've built a beautiful labyrinth and an outdoor chapel and a prayer wall. And so now we really have a place where the community can come, both inside and outside, and hopefully find a bit of an oasis here.
So instead of a parking lot, they renovated the house that was there. I thought for sure at some point do I recall that it was a kind of beaten up house that also served as the youth center at one point? Did you tell me that?
Well, there were times when staff lived here, times when interns lived here. We had a refugee family at one point, but then it really wasn't used once the congregation decided that it would be raised. But, like good churches do, the kids could still come and use it. So youth and confirmands did gather here for a time.
Yeah, I've been a part of that elsewhere. It's very humorous. Is the best way to look at it.
I know.
So you mentioned a lot of things there. There's the spiritual direction that you do. It sounds like a counseling center also that somebody else does.
Yes,
that came later.
Yeah.
Talk to me a little bit about the retreats. What are they like? What happens at a retreat there?
So you can BYO retreat leader if you want, and just come congregation with your own folks leading it or another retreat leader, and just come and use our space. Or if you're looking for retreat leadership, you can have me or other leaders lead as well. And the building is small enough that we really can only provide a day retreat. We have a living room that you can have probably 12 or 13 people comfortably. Dining room, kitchen, 3 breakout rooms upstairs, which is really nice. So you can break off into small groups. People can come for personal retreat time. It's a place of respite. Rostered leaders can come for free. That's always been important to the congregation, that rostered leaders have a safe place to come. So I've had colleagues come and spend a day, and maybe it's just a work day where they're going to come and stretch out and plan Advent, but I've had some come to do an overnight. And actually, we're going to have our first person coming to spend a week who's on sabbatical this week. So all things are possible. All things are possible.
Yeah, you mentioned rostered leaders. You mean pastors and deacons. Yes. I assume this is not just the purview of Lutherans, that others are allowed.
Absolutely. All are welcome. All are welcome. And we've been so intentional about that. We have a very diverse community here in Princeton Junction. And so we were so happy to welcome folks from our local synagogue to do their leadership retreat one day. So that was great to have them. We have folks from all walks of faith walking the labyrinth. Our last intern, for her internship project, she built with a team of folks from Prince of Peace what we call the Tree of Life Chapel, which is a chapel for those who've experienced infant and perinatal loss. As we know, the church has not always stood alongside families, right, who have grieved in that way. Thanks be to God, we now have liturgies and prayers, and gathering resources. But we wanted to have a place where folks could come. And so we've created the Tree of Life Chapel, which is right off of the Labyrinth. And again, because we're in such a diverse community, we created it with symbols that will speak to everyone. And so the one panel is the Tree of Life. At the center of the chapel is a fountain. And you're able to take a stone and put your infant's name on it and place it at the fountain. If you're a Lutheran, you're going to walk in that space and see baptism all over the place. But for every walk of faith, obviously, water speaks very deeply to who we are, as does the symbol of the Tree of Life.
And have you held any gatherings, memorial services there? And can you tell me about that and tell me about one or two?
Absolutely. So we just built it 2 years ago. So October 15th is the National Day for Remembrance for Infant Loss. So on both of the last 2 years, on October 15th, we've gathered and had a service. Families come here all the time. Whenever I go back to sit in the chapel, there's always another stone that's been left with an infant's name. We had a family here one day. The way they heard about it was their clients of our pastoral counselor, and they asked about it, and she took them back there. Well, they brought, it was the wife, her husband, and their 2 children. And they gathered at the chapel. They used the labyrinth. They did some crafts. So they just had a wonderful day, and then took pictures for us so that we could see, what their experience was. So it's been very powerful. It's been very powerful.
I can only imagine, because while all loss is real heartfelt, that particular loss is just deep and lifelong, really.
Absolutely. And talk about a community that I would guess has not felt seen and heard through the years, right? Because they literally did not have a place and a space for that grief to be shared, because that's not what our culture did, right? Our culture, we keep that all private and quiet. And yet we know there is such a need for folks to gather in community. And to be honest, that ministry came because one of our members, their family lost their infant while the mother was still pregnant. And we held a funeral for that infant. And out of that came, from the family, how can we make this possible for other people to gather in community and have a place where they don't have to hold this grief in private, but it can be shared? So it really came not only from the loss in our own congregation, but from that family's deep desire to witness to others and provide for them what they had received here.
Oh, such a gift, such a gift.
Such a gift, such a gift.
Yeah. So, wow, House Next Door, interesting name, not Kairos Center or House Next Door sounds very New Jersey.
That's that's great that you say that, because everybody who I know in New Jersey who hears the name doesn't bat an eye. And anybody I know from out of state goes, next door to what? So I guess it is kind of Jersey.
So maybe in closing, you can just tell us, how can people find out more about you and about House Next Door? Where should they go?
They should go to our website, which is housenextdoornj.org. And there are listed, our upcoming events, who we are, what the ministry is about. This website is such a gift from one of my colleagues who created it for us. It might start to look a little sparse now, because we're going to be ending programming for in May, and June will be our planning months, and we will be mapping out all of next year, starting with September programs. But spiritual direction, group direction goes on all the time. And but you'll see more certainly come the fall.
Yeah, so we're recording this in early May of 2023, and because these podcasts go on into eternity, it sounds like your rhythm is that springtime is the time where you kind of enter into planning for the coming year. But House Next Door, NJ.org. I'll put that in the show notes along with some other information. Dale, so good to have you. I love your energy and enthusiasm for this work.
Well, I keep saying to folks, when I hear people fretting, mourning, grieving, which I understand how much the church is changing, I go, you know what? I can't help but be excited because God is doing a new thing. The Holy Spirit is blowing through this church. And I think the House Next Door is just an example of that. So I think if we listen for that spirit, we can't help but be excited about what's happening in the life of the church.